Chamber Town Talk. We will get started in just a moment. We are set up as a webinar today, so your audio and video are disabled for the length of the conversation this morning, but we do welcome your questions, so please put that in the Q&A function. If for some reason you're having technical difficulties or we're having technical difficulties, please let us know by communicating with us via the chat, and we'll get started in just a minute with this great conversation. All right, I think it's time to get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Levens. I am the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. So happy to have you here today. We are set up as a webinar, so you'll notice that both your audio and video are disabled, but we do want to interact with you. So please submit questions for any of our panelists today in the Q&A function. If we're having any sort of technical difficulties, please let us know via the chat. And we also are going to do some tweeting today, so you can see on the bottom of this screen that our handle is there and the hashtag for today is Northeast Town Talk. The Northeast Minneapolis Chamber Town Talk is a long-term running series that provides both members, community, and the curious with the opportunity to explore all kinds of opportunities, challenges, and developments that are impacting Northeast Minneapolis, but also the broader city and the broader region. So today we're going to talk about a lot of things, and I'm really interested and engaged in this engaging conversation. You're going to find that it's about place, space, art, and also very much about language and understanding. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Town Talk is brought to you by a series of supportive sponsors who have been with us for many, many years, including CenterPoint Energy, Wells Fargo, and Xcel Energy. We'd like to thank them for their support and can't wait till we can all be in person to do this together. And I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I'm going to let them do a lot of that work themselves, but want to share how happy I am and all of us for their willingness to participate today. First, we have Dr. Brenda Kazar. Then we have Tricia Herring, Witsu Soko, and Alejandra Polenka. And they are going to lead this conversation today. I think you're going to find it incredibly engaging and inspiring. And I think you may find that there's a call of action or two as well as we make our way through. So please, I'm going to hand it over right to Dr. Brenda Kazar to lead our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, I'm Brenda Kazar. I'm the collaborative strategist and owner of Urbane Dr. K Consulting. Through my consulting, I help design and conduct research to help my clients, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, strategically plan and advocate for their goals and causes. I'm an urban geographer. I've authored research and taught for several decades about social justice and inequality in the built landscape. I focused on economic development and gentrification, and this current work focused on the creative sector actually grew out of that work. So I look at the role that arts and culture play in development, revitalization, and community efforts. And so my apologies, I'm gonna reference my notes a little bit here in honor of time because I could talk about this a lot. But today's discussion is really focused on cultural districts, in part because the city of Minneapolis recently adopted an ordinance designating 7 corridors within the city as cultural districts. And so the National Endowment for the Arts states that cultural districts should strengthen local economies, enhance community sense of place, and deepen opportunities for arts and cultural organizations. The City of Minneapolis Cultural District Project proposes drawing on cultural district development concepts to ensure businesses and entrepreneurs thrive, to enhance sense of place and draw additional customers and tourists to the districts, to promote and deepen cultural capacities by spotlighting each corridor's rich cultural heritage. And in tandem, The city seeks to employ the resources, policies, and practices necessary in their district efforts to protect the racial and cultural diversity and to uplift, not push out, existing communities of color, Indigenous people, and immigrant populations. But there remains a lot of confusion around the term cultural district and concern about revitalization efforts that will lead to displacement. So to offer some context for that, for today's discussion, I'm going to draw from a study that I completed for the Graves Foundation that addresses these tensions by looking at the history of cultural district formation in the US. But first, I'd just like to offer up a framework for thinking about the term cultural district. So social groups that share class, ethnic, religious, or cultural backgrounds engage in interactions, and these interactions tether cultural significance to places. And repeated social interaction in buildings and on streets and in entire neighborhoods produce a sense of community, privilege and ownership and pride in place. And so dwelling in a place becomes a key element in the development of a person's sense of themselves, of their belonging to place. So to put it simply, place is central to our idea of community and our sense of belonging. It's the bricks and mortar of our cultural identity. And this is true for all cultural groups, but for some, place is also a refuge of racial, ethnic, religious, and gender solidarity as well. So historically, clustering in specific areas of the city, groups that shared cultural traits has been both voluntary and involuntary. So we can kind of look at industrialization in the early 1900s. I use the example, waves of immigrants from coming into Chicago. There was some practice of self-sorting there, obviously for housing and employment, working through ward bosses that spoke their native language, and they could also come together and share space with familiar shared beliefs and social practices. But outside forces have segregated populations by class, race, ethnicity, religion, and gender through institutional means as well. And so a less nostalgic reflection of those naturally occurring cultural districts in Chicago would show that most of the groups faced some form of discrimination, barriers to upward mobility, barriers to access to various parts of the city. So for some groups, restricted access to the whole city meant that there was a longer time in a concentrated area of the city. And then institutional practices extended that time and also limited the possibility of property ownership. So, planning, lending decisions, zoning, deed restrictions, redlining, we have this history. And the history explains the less than voluntary clustering of some populations in certain areas of the city. And it's important to our present day understanding of the tension and concern that exist within communities that live in these cultural districts. Arts and culture are embedded in this story. They're embedded in the daily life of every cultural group in the music, dance, visual representation of heritage. And they're also embedded in the planning of cities. So historically, arts and culture have been looked at by planners and developers as an antidote for any of the ills of the city. And so we have large scale museums and cultural centers that are centered in planned districts and downtowns. But in the 1970s, a new sort of phenomenon started, which was commercial and industrial space vacancies opened up and created workspace opportunities for artists and arts organizations that were seeking affordable rents. And this acted as a pathway in some ways to the occupation of certain areas of the city by higher income groups, displacing lower income artists and the informal production and activity of the district, but also displacing people that were living in the community and had been in communities for a long time. Despite the displacement for several decades, the 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s, this kind of transformation was really looked at as something that was a positive economic development success. And it became a model for revitalization in many cities. And additionally, noting the transformative power of culture within communities and the pride in place associated with arts and culture within those communities. There were also a lot of small intervention practices, expanding art centers and studios and production space, theater renovations, beautification through public art, expanded cultural celebrations and attractions. But oftentimes combining this arts and cultural activity with relatively affordable home prices and workspace rents, proximity to downtown oftentimes, walkability of the neighborhoods. Again, this attracted middle income buyers, fostered speculative investment, renovations, new development. And again, from an economic perspective, it's seen as district success, but when levels of displacement of existing businesses and residents achieve high levels, you've got gentrification, complete turnover of population. So it's a very real concern in many lower income communities about being erased through displacement, rising rents, property taxes, demolished affordable space, development of new and unaffordable projects. This is the bricks and mortar that's the reality of everyday life in many previously disinvested areas. And for BIPOC and lower income communities who are still experiencing the impacts of income disparities, this loss of community is really acutely felt. So to truly celebrate the possibilities of art, culture, and creative placemaking, we need to consider place specificity and enact earnest policies and practices aimed at mitigating the gentrifying impacts witnessed in other communities throughout the United States. And so I'm just setting the stage here for a conversation around creative placemaking and place by looking at the reality of property exchange, of institutional practices. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues who face the challenges and experience the difficulties of enacting the benefit of art and culture every day in communities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alejandra Polenka next. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So let me just share my screen here. Give me 1 minute. Okay, oops. There we go. Everyone's seen the PowerPoint there? Okay, great. Oops. My notes are not showing up. Just give me a second. There we go. Okay, sorry, everyone. Hi, my name is Alejandra Polenka, and I currently serve as the Director of Creative Placemaking for the City of Bloomington. Previously, I was a director of NEMA, and that was such an enriching experience. I'm so grateful to have been able to work in Northeast alongside the artists, businesses, and organizations. But today I'm just going to touch a little bit more on just creative placemaking and public art and how those efforts can be beneficial to the community and bring stakeholders together, and also provide some resources at the end. I'm going to go through it really quickly, so feel free to ask questions at the end of the presentations. So during the development of Bloomington South Loop District Plan, creative placemaking was really identified as an evolving field and an important process to weave into community development. So in 2013, our partner in this work, Artistry in the city, collaborated to obtain a grant from the NEA and launched the development of creative placemaking plan for the South Loop. So the development of this plan included stakeholder engagement, demonstration projects, and outcomes including defining a vision and goals, solidifying our partnership with Artistry, and the recommendation to develop a creative placemaking commission and a staff position within the city. So if you're unfamiliar with the South Loop District, it's located in Bloomington, east of Highway 77, south of 494, north of Longmeadow Lake and Minnesota River. So it runs parallel to the Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge. So just a few of the project outcomes we've explored include large and small scale sculptures, so traditional public art, walking theater productions, scavenger hunts, community engagement and artist-led activities, a variety of events, different performances, including hosting the parking ramp project by Nietzsche Arts, temporary art installations, art activities and workshops, an augmented reality tour on Old Cedar Avenue Bridge, utility box wraps, and more. And then of course, murals. So these photos depict the process for the Wrights Lake Park community mural called Seasons of Becoming by Good Space Murals. And their process included a community-led design and painting sessions. An upcoming mural we'll have is with Oishi, who will be curating 8 murals along the wall that's almost 800 feet long, and each will be assigned to a different artist while utilizing a tiled system and a color theme. So I just want to highlight a few ways that creative placemaking can be beneficial to the community. One is that it can protect your neighborhood identity. We know that artists and culture bearers can lift up the stories of existing stakeholders by using creative storytelling techniques. And as a process, creative placemaking also focuses on highlighting and honoring the history of that place. It can also spur economic development. So safer neighborhoods can drive up foot traffic, supporting local businesses, and investing in cultural assets, hiring local creatives, and providing a platform for artists and culture bearers to engage with community issues can also support their role in the neighborhood and the larger creative economy. And on that note, in addition, investing in the creative engine will accelerate the economic recovery of our community. And I want to highlight that we've recently commissioned a Bloomington Creative MN report and found that the arts and culture sector has a $12.1 million economic impact on the city of Bloomington. It fosters 296 full-time equivalent jobs in addition to nearly $900,000 in government revenues. So this is an incredible contribution to the local service providers, businesses, retailers, restaurants, and the overall economy. So investment in the creative economy really offers a strong return on investment, especially in the wake of COVID-19. I also want to acknowledge that I haven't talked about the implications or consequences creative placemaking can have. And placemaking is centered around creating equitable gathering places and fostering walkability. So there are many important questions to consider when pursuing this process. These are just a few, including what are the ways in which communities are empowered to become active agents in the co-creation and continued stewardship of their public spaces, who is involved in the process, and what's the intention. So this is not an exhaustive list, just a few links and resources. The presentation will be shared for reference afterwards, but I do want to highlight a few resources. So ArtPlace has so many case studies of creative placemaking projects that define the community whose lives they seek to enhance. They describe the positive change that the group of people wants, clearly outline an arts-based intervention to bring about that result, and create a method of measuring that change. So it's very helpful to review those case studies. Some of the arts-based interventions are around the topics of health, workforce development, housing, and more. I'm sure you also are all or mostly familiar with two local organizations. Forecast Public Art, for one, it, for example, offers an Institute for Equitable Public Art Practice and other helpful workshops and services. And Springboard for the Arts is a favorite, and they are a great resource. I recommend their creative, their Creative People Power Report and Irrigate Toolkit, which is an artist-led creative placemaking model and offers community organizing training and fosters business and organizational partnerships for creative activity. And so with that, I'll leave that. But again, this slide deck will be shared for future reference if interested. I'll stop my share here and I'll pass it on to the next panelist. Thanks.
I think that's me. Hi, everyone. Trisha Hearing. I'm a little shaky today. In full transparency, I'm recovering from a COVID vaccine, so I feel a little off, but I'm going to do my best to stay with you. I am just going to share a little bit about my personal context and sort of what I bring into this conversation, just so you understand where I'm coming from, as you've heard from Brenda and Ale, where they're coming from and what their work entails. I live in Northeast Minneapolis, and so I'm coming into this conversation as a resident of the place that we are looking at, and as well as someone who's built a business in this neighborhood. I think it's important to think about our relation to places, especially when doing transformative work in those places. And I'll just say that I was actually born in Bangkok, Thailand, and I grew up overseas as a mixed race American. So I never actually lived in the US until I was 18 years old. When I moved here, though, I found myself in Northeast Minneapolis, which is interesting because my grandfather on my father's side, who is originally was born and raised in Minnesota, worked in Northeast Minneapolis for many years. He was working class. He was a laborer in the beer factories that existed in Northeast a long time ago. And I just remember stories that my father told me of going to pick up his dad from work and just like what he looked like at the end of the day after working in those factories, and just what it meant to have a father that sort of did that kind of physical labor. And so it's sort of that context that I think about as I walk through Northeast Minneapolis now into the fancy breweries that we have, and just the economy that they create and the way that they are small businesses for different people. And I think about my grandfather, who's no longer alive, like what he might think of those spaces and what Northeast has become. I remember him always, of course, referring to it as Northeast, as a lot of German immigrants did. I moved to Northeast about 12 years ago. So I've been in this neighborhood for 12 years. Some of my first experiences were actually in the Tyler Street, kind of where Bauhaus is right now. And what else is over there? I don't know what it's called now, but it's like the Dogwood building that runs along there. So that building was actually occupied pretty illegally by artists. There were a lot of artists that had studio spaces in that building that they were living in. I was dating someone who had a space in that building. And so I remember the fire marshal would come in the morning sometimes, and we would have to like hide that we were living there. And so it's just really interesting to think just 12 years ago, artists were able to kind of take up space in that way and really have large studio spaces for music and for performance. And it wasn't, you know, the sort of developed studios that we have today. Around that same time, I started an arts organization called Public Functionary. It was off Buchanan and Broadway on 12th Avenue, in this like very nondescript building. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Public Functionary. And I remember when we first opened the space and told people where it was, people were like, where is that? It seemed like that space in Northeast, that little pocket, was kind of like, you know, not an area that people were familiar with, not somewhere that people went. And now that area is just sort of in the center of all of the developing action in Northeast. And we ran the space for about 6 years and closed in 2019 in order to try to find a bigger space, because honestly, we had really outgrown our 2,500 square feet. And so we were really excited to find a new space, but it proved to be pretty difficult in Northeast Minneapolis. It was important for us to stay in the neighborhood and keep building the organization in Northeast Minneapolis. And it became very, very clear that developers were kind of taking up spaces and prices were rising. And we looked at so many different options and nothing really seemed viable. ArtSpace purchased the Northrop King building campus. And so that became a really big opportunity for us because we had started a studio program in the Northrop King building. And that happened from within. So the artist Leslie Barlow, who's part of our organization, was an artist of color in the building. She felt very isolated in the Northrop King building. And Debbie, the owner at the time, talked to her about starting a program where BIPOC artists could be supported to have space in the building. And so she gave us a really good deal, and we partnered with Leslie to start what is now our Studio 400 program, supporting BIPOC artists, not just to have studio space, but to really understand how to create a sustainable studio practice. And it's been an uphill battle, I have to say. you don't just plop artists into the building and think they're going to be okay. There's a whole culture within the Northrop King building, and there's been artists that have had space there for a long time and that feel that that is their space. And so a change, a generational change, a demographic change to those spaces isn't always the easiest thing. So it's been really big news that's come out recently, but Public Functionary was granted the Intermedia Arts funds. We applied through an RFP process, and so we've been just gifted this amazing opportunity to build, an arts organization in Northeast Minneapolis at the Northrop King campus in some of the underutilized buildings around the back that we sometimes don't realize there's so many buildings on the Northrop King property that are just empty. So we have a 5-year plan. We'll be building a performance venue, an exhibition venue, and continuing to build our studio program. I am at this place really interested in what it means for me to create an arts organization in Northeast after 12 years of being in this neighborhood and thinking about where it's going. I'm really interested in how artists are able to sustain and thrive and build wealth in Northeast Minneapolis. I have a lot of friends that live in the neighborhood that struggle to find an apartment that they can afford, struggle to find studio space that they can afford. And I think that there's a lot of interest with the cultural district development, with creative placemaking and all of these initiatives to use artists to create change, to create culture. And I say use artists because that is often what happens. And so what I'm interested in is how we don't use artists, but instead how we actually help artists build relationships, how they build opportunities, how the public art engagements that they do, the murals that they paint, how they're not transactional, but how they end up becoming opportunities for them to build their businesses, to build their practices. So there is so much opportunity in Northeast, but it's going to be important for us to think actively the entire time about who is benefiting from the opportunities and how deep those benefits go, as opposed to a one-time mural commission, that ends up just making a corner look pretty. So yeah, that's a little bit of my, what I'm coming into this conversation with. And I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Whit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Whit Siasoko. I'm a community-based artist here in Northeast Minneapolis. I've lived in Northeast for over 20 years, and hopefully I can share this screen. Can everybody see that? Can I get a thumbs up if you can? Okay, good. So I'm a resident of Northeast for over 20 years. Most of my art is in the public realm, and I just really think that art is a catalyst for convening, and conversation and civic space. So the other thing that I believe in is meeting people where they're at. You'll see a lot of this throughout the work. We had a brief discussion in a pre-meeting about the term placemaking, and as much as I'm tied to a lot of this work, because you'll see throughout the slides that I have worked a lot with urban planners, I really believe in this relational relationship to community versus a transactional relationship to a community. There's a lot of polars that I can use. I mean, sustainability versus extraction, Eros versus logo. All these things really are about a one-to-one relationship, and usually that comes from my participation, and that can be totally co-opted in a way, and I tried to tread lightly with that, and I've been doing this for a while, and you can see throughout the slides that I've worked with urban planning processes for a long time. I feel like I'm a civically involved citizen. I've been on the Holland Neighborhood Board. I've served on public art panels and a lot of stuff that doesn't even do with art. So where that intersection of my private life really does intersect a lot with my public life in a career sense. So I'll just skip this. The beginnings of my career started really at the Walker Art Center. I worked there for over 13 years, working with teenagers, and this experience with an arts institution really grounded me. Some of my formative years were really spent in this thing called the Walker on Wheels, and this thing was a a way that the institution could bring art out to the surrounding communities. I spent my summer, my first summer in 1999 in Frogtown, working with Spencer Nagasako, an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, and working with kids in that neighborhood. And it really opened my eyes to, you know, the ways that art could reach people, and the way that it connect with people, and the way that it could foster conversation. I found myself going back to the museum and like giving tours, and then, you know, I felt a real like sanitized look at art. It was like stagnant objects that live in these white walled spaces. And I totally believe in artists in whatever setting. Like, I'll fight tooth and nail for a studio artist that shows conceptual work or minimalist work, but like really I had to find out my own relationship to art, and that really developed over 20 years. And so I quit working at the museum. I had some time at the Minneapolis Institute of Art as well. But really for me, art lives in public space. Here's a project that I did with John Reynolds called Street Corner Letterpress. And we created postcards for neighborhoods and encouraged people to write to their neighbors. This is another project. I'll just kind of zoom through these. But this is a project called This Home Is Not For Sale. It was a collaboration with a bunch of poets through Poetry for People, led by Diver Van Avery. And we created these yard signs that spoke to it spoke to affordable housing. We partnered with the community, City of Lakes Community Land Trust, and worked with people that lived in previously foreclosed homes to create these yard signs. And they still live in the neighborhoods, mostly in the Powderhorn neighborhood and Central neighborhood. But these events brought people together, and the impetus was art. So you can see a couple of these yard signs. But really a formative experience for me was the inaugural year of Creative City Making. It brings together artists with city planners from the city of Minneapolis. And for that year, we really worked on a historic preservation project. And through this, I created art engagements, one of them being the mobile tracing unit, which was an idea. Basically, you trace things that you deem historic or things that should be preserved. And you know, the way that the city looks at preservation is very different than the way that the community looks at preservation. And so we did over 400, 500 drawings with people all over the city using this device, and brought together. This was a teen workshop that I also did as a part of Creative City Making, where I worked with teenagers and we created screen prints along Central Avenue and displayed the artwork with local businesses. This was a page out of the book of Wing Young Yui. I don't want to go too in depth into any of these projects because I am running short on time. This is a project that I did with the Capital Area Architectural Planning Board, and we interviewed over, I don't know, I think it was over 200 residents, met them where they're at the liquor store, at White Castle, where else, at the community center, at the holiday station, and got their thoughts and asked them about the future of Rice Street. From there, we created over 50 portraits, transferred them onto cinder blocks, and each time we had a community meeting, these cinder blocks would be out leading a trail to the community meeting itself. And along with that, we did a storefront installation that really distilled some of the thoughts of the residents. When we do ask people about the future of districts and neighborhoods, a lot of times people are skeptical, as you can see in this, in this slide. Marianne is afraid that the city has wiped out other neighborhoods before, like Rondo, and is skeptical of the process. So you can check that out. I think it's going to live at the Victoria Theater and Arts Center here in the coming months. This is another project that we did along Central Avenue, but it seems like I'm running short on time. The impetus for this was a partnership with Hennepin County. They saw the need to reach out to immigrants that live in Northeast Minneapolis because their participation historically in the census was very low. And so through this, we reached over 100 people that identify as immigrants, 100 people that didn't know about the census and hadn't filled out the census, and over 100 people that actually live in the neighborhood. So I think it was an incredibly successful program, and the impetus was art. So this was done in partnership with Carry On Homes, which is a group of artists that come from various countries and create art installations that speak about immigration. My proudest achievement, though, is really working with Juxtaposition Arts. And this is actually not a temporary space, it's a permanent space. It's a Skateable Art Plaza on the corner of Emerson and Broadway. I hope you can check this out. I'm not going to go too far in depth in it, but basically, we designed this with their environmental design team, which is a group of 12 young people, high school students, that learn about designing spaces, learn how to do mock-ups, and learn how to test furniture and stuff like that. So we created this in partnership with them, and it's highly used space. It's right in the middle of North Minneapolis, and it's at an active bus stop. We see over 100 kids every week using this space, and it combines art and skateboarding, two of my passions. But here's some slides from that. I just wanted to end with this because this is a mural that I did last summer, and really end with like, you know, there's a lot of development going on in the city. Sometimes we just need to, this mural is called Wild Seed. And it really is about like looking at the things that exist, the things that grow up out of the cracks, the things that maybe are in the blind spot of the city, and fostering those things that actually exist and supporting those things versus just focusing on the background. So with that, I'll just leave it to the panel to answer some questions.
Thanks, everyone. And Whit, I love that we ended on this part of the presentation on an image. I think that's really important. So thank you for positioning us that way. I am so glad that you all brought your relationship to space and your relationship to Northeast Minneapolis. Brenda, you know, also is a near resident, and as am I, into this conversation, because it truly is important and informs, I think, how we look at space and place. So I'd like to start with a question about how folks like us who live in a space, a neighborhood, have the words we want to use for where we are. How do we bring, I guess it's a two-part question. How do we bring more understanding about what place is and what it can be, as well as the support of space? So how do we create an environment where we can celebrate where we are, look at it as, you know, an asset, to Whit, your image of what do we see? Like, how do we get a vision and language around place? And then I guess the second question is engagement. That was a little bifurcated, but how should we talk about it? Because I think there's a lot of ideas here. And I welcome anyone who wants to get started. This is the longest pause ever. I know you all have thoughts. So maybe just the first part is, how do we talk about a place that should be accessible to everyone? And maybe it's the should be part of the question that we should talk about.
I can jump in. I
knew you would.
For me, like meeting people at bus stops on their way to work, meeting people where they're in transit, and asking and really listening is a big part of it. Like, there's a lot of times there's open meetings like this, or like a neighborhood meeting, but who's not coming, right? And how are we actually going to them? You know, is it their house? Is it the bus stop? You know, and the way that we look at like who actually has the say, you know, it isn't just homeowners. It's like people that actually use the space. Like, I met a whole bunch of people. I'm doing an installation at the corner of Lowry and Central, but like, you know, talk to people at the bus stop. They've been using that bus stop for over 20 years. That doesn't mean that they don't own the space as well, you know? And like, so like the way that we like do our outreach, the way we take in information, the way we like listen is super important, and it should reflect those residents. I'll just leave it at that.
And I'll jump into on kind of piggybacking on that. I think we spend a lot of time talking about place in terms of dollars and cents. So, you know, we look at the exchange value versus the lived value or the experiential value of a place. And I think that that creates inaccessibility just in the way that we conceive of a place. So if we, you know, if we want to bring everyone to the table, you know, we understanding that economic side of it is really important, because we want to make places affordable so that people can live and can work. But at the same time, if that's the only conversation that we're having, you know, we're never going to achieve anything, because we're always looking at property as if what's the highest and best use of that property and giving it a dollar value, as opposed to, you know, what is the like social best use of that property and what could that mean? And so I think we have this sort of very black and white way of talking about place that has to do with economics. And to what Whit was saying, I also feel that, yes, when we hear about place from others or about the experience of place, you know, I moved here to Minneapolis in 2007. And I remember colleagues at the university, when I was talking about living in Northeast, you know, making comments about, well, is that really a safe place for you? Or, you know, like, yeah. But they're, you know, they had no experience of place, and they were looking at place from maybe the perspective of their experience within their own community, and couldn't relate that much of what happens in their own community is exactly what's happening in Northeast. So they were just looking at, I think, kind of clouded by that economic value of the place, that it wasn't the high-end place that maybe they thought I should be looking at, which I couldn't afford anyway. But so anyway, I'll stop. But that's kind of, I think there's a real dichotomy that we have to get over when we talk about place.
And I'll just touch on the continued stewardship of public places and spaces, and, you know, just really thinking about, you know, what kind of training or tools are available for communities so that they can maintain these spaces and have more ownership of them. You know, how, in terms of design, that's really important. How does it relate to that community's specific needs? How do we make room for diverse activities and, you know, different ways of interacting socially so that really everyone feels welcome within that space? Who do these spaces serve? What kinds of activities and events are you having there? You know, really, what vision does the community have for that space, and how can you make sure that they're part of the ongoing sustainability and ongoingness of that place?
Trisha, you talked a lot about the need for change around transaction between, you know, with a commission of art, and I think that kind of reflects here also. Do you have a little more that you can bring to that as we talk about who is in a space and changing that narrative? Because I think we're all talking about changes, and I know that there's some things we can do there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about bringing more art into Northeast in the public space realm. I mean, we know that Northeast has a lot of studio spaces, and if you go inside of them, you have access to art. But living in the neighborhood, a lot of people will say there's not a lot of murals. You know, there's not as much out. You don't see it as much on the, you know, on the streets and in different areas. And I'm actually working right now with 3 neighborhood associations in Northeast, Beltrami and Logan and Northeast Park, and they came together as neighborhood associations and, you know, got some funds together and are going to do 3 murals in their parks. And they really are figuring out how to do this as they go. And so in that, they've put a lot of trust in the artists to show them how to create murals, how to make them happen, how to do community engagement around it. And it's really different. It feels really different because they're not controlling it too much and saying, this is exactly what we want. You know, they're saying like, okay, can you, as artists that work and live in this neighborhood, can you tell us like how we should do these murals? And I think just having the control be within, you know, neighborhoods, people that are part of those neighborhood associations, you know, they're going to try and do some outdoor stuff so that people who are in the park just playing basketball and hanging out can be part of those conversations. And so I think it's just moving away from this sort of like top level public art commission where it's some larger entity that's commissioning the work, and then having artists submit, you know, work samples and resumes and all of these requirements so that to prove that they are trustworthy to execute these projects, you know, and instead understanding that in just creating the murals, these neighborhood associations are developing relationships with some artists in the community, you know. So I think just thinking differently about, you know, how these projects happen and really removing the gatekeeper aspect of it, which happens a lot with public art commissions. And then you end up with, you know, murals and artworks that don't necessarily reflect the community. And people are like, how did that happen? Why did that happen? You know?
Thank you. And that's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is, you know, to your point, meeting people where they are, you know, using interactions in whatever mechanism, activation, you know, Ale, to your point, and, you know, Brenda, to the idea of an external narrative. How do we use this information and these interactions to inform a narrative? Like, do we have the opportunity to do narrative work about our community through these types of you know, activities and conversations? Like, do you think that's one of the things that we can do to start to, you know, talk about the idea of cultural corridors? Brenda, to your point about it's more than built space, but it is built space. Like, is there an opportunity to do that? And I'm just thinking about this myself.
I'll just hop in. I mean, I've done this. I did the project This Home Is Not For Sale with the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. And, you know, as much as I want to rail against capitalism, it's not going away anytime soon. And development obviously is a part of that. And everybody's like tied into economics in some way. But there is ways that models out there that we don't have to do it on the backs of other people. We can do it with mutual benefit. We can do things that actually benefit everybody, not just one particular segment of society. But, you know, and I think it's really thinking about those cooperative models, those ways that artists can actually own, or low-income people can actually own their own houses. Like, obviously affordable housing is a gigantic issue in our city. We see people being pushed out to Brooklyn Center, Richfield. Like, it's aberrant, you know. It's like, it's shameful that this is happening, and the arts are contributing to this. So how do we hold it down for artists? How do we hold it down for communities of color? How do we hold it down for low-income people? And that really should be at the top of the list, is like, how do we jointly own, and how do we not like extract, you know, so much that it's on the backs of others. I mean, that's very general, but it's such a thing that needs to be talked about. How do we do this? How do we move forward in a just way in developing, and how do we not extract from others in order to do so? So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, like, a lot of this work should be across sectors. So, you know, there should be nonprofits involved, artists, residents, visitors, you know, obviously the city or a public entity as well. And so, you know, in working with them to look at those solutions, just for example, the Bloomington City Council recently established a $15 million affordable housing trust fund that preserved 306 affordable units in South Loop. So, you know, there's things that I can't do within my role outright, but there are things that if you're working with everyone, if you have a shared goal and shared understanding, you should be working with multiple partners on creating and sustaining a place.
I think that I'll just hop in one more time, is just that the way that we evaluate too, and identifying that right away. I mean, we talked about this in the pre-meeting, but like maybe a metric, the top metric is like, are the businesses, the immigrant businesses along Central Avenue, do they still exist, and how many of them still exist after this thing has started? You know, so like really being specific about your metric and like abiding by that. And making that transparent is a part of like any of these placemaking projects, you know, and talking about like how we can resolve that is super important.
Yeah, had kind of the same thought process with about just really understanding as we talk about community in Northeast Minneapolis. And I often go straight to like, well, who is that community? Like, who are you picturing? What do you see when you think about the community in Northeast Minneapolis? Do we know how many studios there are and how many studios are occupied by people that have a certain wealth level? Do we know how many of artists of color are in those studio spaces? I know Brenda's done a lot of study on who is in spaces, but those types of things, really having an awareness of them to know where the disparities are. Home ownership, you know, like how many people of color are able to actually purchase homes in Northeast Minneapolis. You know, I recently went through trying to buy a home in this neighborhood. It was not fun. So, you know, I think there's just really understanding who is the community and which direction is it trending, so that we're aware of it. I always encourage people to go out to the Northeast Parade every year, because in the parade, you know, I think we can add a lot to the parade. I've always had that opinion, but I love the parade because you see the neighborhood. You see who comes out on the streets. And when you walk up and down, like, you're like, oh, you know, I can actually see the people that live and work in these businesses. And it feels very different than Art Whirl. It's not the same crowd that comes out to Art Whirl. So I think just really knowing who lives in the neighborhood is important.
That's great. And of course, some of you may or may not know, but the Chamber is the community host of the Northeast Parade. So when Trish and I first talked, I was like, really? That's good news, I think, with status of 2021 parade still pending. But it's a funny thing. And you're right. It is absolutely, you know, our community comes to the curbside to watch marching bands. It's exceptional. Brenda, sorry, I didn't mean to catch up.
Oh, I was just gonna hop in and think. I mean, that's like, I think about murals, and I think about like the Wall of Respect in Chicago, the famous Wall of Respect on the South Side, a building that actually got torn down, that, you know, depicted African American, you know, famous African Americans to say this, you know, this is our community, this is who we are, this is who we honor, this is who we aspire to. You know, the Chicano murals in the 70s and 80s that were, you know, in public housing and underpasses in LA, also representing like, this is what we do. This is, you know, this is our community. And those murals were meant to say to people from outside, this is, you know, this is who we are. This is our narrative. This is the narrative we own, not the one that you're giving us based on whatever our property values are or whatever, you know, knowing that, you know, infrastructure hasn't been kept up in those neighborhoods in the same way as other neighborhoods. But I think that, you know, thinking about the murals along Central Avenue and the possibilities there, you know, these should be thought of as a way to, how do we help those businesses? So like those, you know, those immigrant businesses that we kind of, you know, like to hold up as being wonderful, because they are, but, you know, that's what we like to hold up as being the great thing about Central Avenue. Let's not look at the murals as a way to benefit Central Avenue or the cultural district, but let's look at those murals as a way to benefit those businesses. How do we market them? How do we tell their story? How do we do their narrative? But from their perspective, not how we see them or outsiders see them, but, you know, like them, like let them have a say, and then let them get the benefit for their business from it. And I think that's the, anyway, I'm going on, but that's my
intersection space.
I mean, narrative should be from the voice of who, you know, let others tell their own story instead of creating a story. I'm thinking of like those awful murals in the 80s that were like old timey with, you know, Ian. But, you know, the idea of like, capturing, oh, we're going to capture this one moment in time And that's going to represent,
Not have the fluidity.
it's like, no.
Yeah, that's not us. No.
Anyway,
I'm gonna
sorry.
no, I'm gonna pause our organic conversation here because it looks like we have a couple questions and some comments. So I'm gonna skip around a little bit. Lisa, thanks for putting in the chat that our kind of mutual friend, I think to most of us on the screen, Jamie Schumacher, who is working at LISC, who's a past leader at Northeast and West Bank, new book coming out. There's my plug, Jamie. Is collecting data about small business and cultural corridors and doing some charting. So we'll learn more about that. And here's a question from Jamie. I'm going to pop through it real quick, and we've got one more. I lost track of time. That means it's good. Okay, Jamie says, hi, I love hearing from all of you. One of the things I've been thinking a lot more about lately in this people and place-based work, which she loves, specifically I've been thinking about impacts and effects on folks from diaspora communities that haven't been able to achieve those critical concentrations by property or even renting groups. This is a case for her immigrant family. Everybody is spread out. How can we work together to make sure the cultural district's work in creative placemaking work support our diaspora communities too? ? Who can jump in with that? I want to say a ringer, but who wants to take on Jamie's big question? Do we all need to call her later?
Well, I just, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want, and I mean, affordability, gentrification is a symptom of a much larger issue of housing and workspace provision that is like centuries old. Well, not centuries, but a century old at this point, of like building to supply instead of building to demand. And so we have so much to undo in that conversation. I just kind of want to set that, so there's that reality. So like in some ways there are, the speculation that takes place in these cultural districts once they start having some improvements because of, these small arts and cultural interventions, is because, there's just the demand is so great because there's such a little supply. And so I'm going to go to Ale's comment earlier about, this is not something, arts and culture is not going to solve this problem. And it's got to be in tandem with other policies and practices to solve those issues of affordability, of ownership, of, and all of those in all the corridors, the population that could potentially get displaced, they're at risk because they haven't been able to obtain ownership. They haven't been able to be part of that capitalist market, as Whit said. And it's not going away, and that's not going to change. And so, so all of this does have to be in tandem with other practices. Yeah, it's not a problem solver. It's it's part of the problem solution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, do others have some thoughts for Jamie? Otherwise, there's another question. And then Tom, I see that you've raised your hand, but we can't see you. Can you drop your question into the chat? That would be great. Other reflections on Jamie's question? Whit?
I would just say that, once again, cooperatives, I mean, it isn't always the answer, but you look at the Mercado Central and like
right.
how successful, wildly successful that's been over many years.
Yeah.
In the Somali market on 26th, it's like those, vendor situations where a new immigrant family could maybe like get a foothold and then move to bricks and mortar. It's like those spaces are vital to new businesses, and also creating those places where where new immigrant communities can come together and form relationships. So in any way that we can support those along Central Avenue or any place in the city is well needed, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to go quickly to a question from Margot that I don't know that any of us collectively have the answer to. And then wrap us up. Thank you, those that are hanging on. We're just a little over time. So Margot is asking, so what's the plan timeline? How much money is available to the Central Avenue Cultural Corridor? So in this case, this is the designation is from the city of Minneapolis and the city council. So they are, they have these designated areas, and right now what I have seen is in some of the standard tools that the city has, that there are additional resources that are available beyond what other amounts have been for cultural corridors. So right now, those tools are through the Great Streets Business District Support Program. There's some other programs that the city does in terms of their facade grant program, where there's some additional conversations. So you're really using it as a conduit for resources to get into the cultural corridors to provide resources for sustainability. So Margot, that's probably not the answer you want, and I don't have a specific like where are the dollars and where do they go, but it's across 7 districts, and Central is included between 18th and 26th is the map. So not to answer your question, and that I think will kind of just bring me into my last kind of comment, and that was kind of that was truly the inspiration for this conversation, is because Central Avenue is a cultural corridor designated by the city. There was access to this new additional funding, and the Northeast Chamber for a long period of time has accessed those funds through our response for proposal, and have utilized that dollars to support our artist partners and our organizational partners. Reference that Jamie's on the call. Jamie and LA and I did projects that were really getting into data about who is working in Northeast. Trisha, to some of your questions about who's in what building, how do they identify, do they live in Northeast or do they live elsewhere? Like getting the data that could support other discoveries, having a conversation in community about what makes Northeast a destination. How do we build a narrative that's inclusive of all of the assets? We have a site that was developed called Destination Northeast that has not had a lot of love lately, but it was created to do just that, to bring people into our community and then create an interactive and a different experience. So if you come from Minnetonka because you love the Anchor, what else is around you when you're at the Anchor? Well, really a lot. So how do you do that discovery process? So the most recent round of Great Streets funding, we've put forth a proposal to to engage community and artists around placing murals on Central within the corridor. So that started this other conversation about how to do this best, and have really appreciated information from Brenda about space and built environment and history, but then Trisha and Whit also talking to me about how do we do this best, leaning away from transactional, Brenda, to your point of private businesses want to engage in this, and using it as an opportunity to start conversation and narrative. So you'll see more about that, and hopefully that project can start to do some of the work that we're talking about here in terms of building narrative and hopefully inspiring more of this sort of activation and kind of community work with this project as a potential catalyst. I'm going to quick look at these 3 messages. Everybody's kind of hanging on here, which I appreciate. Thank you, Whit, for putting in your email. Josh, I think this is probably you, Josh Blanc. Thank you for all your comments and work. The Northeast Minneapolis Arts District was awarded a UM Cura intern. Congratulations. To study our inventory of buildings and help understand what we have in the Arts District. Love to connect with intern and get this going. That's great news. And Jamie says, thanks. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for those of you who have joined us today for the conversation. I think any of our panelists here would invite more conversation, as do I. So Brenda, Whit, Trisha, and Ale, thank you so much for taking this opportunity and this conversation. And hopefully we've all kind of inspired some more thoughtfulness. And we will see everyone else soon, and hopefully together, we'll see some very thoughtfully sourced, curated, informed murals on Central before the snow flies. All right, thanks everybody. Oh, hey Steve. Bye everyone, and thanks so
everyone.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.